In the last video, we discussed how to warp drum clips, so let's continue with the options available for warping other types of audio clips. I've got exercise 7 from chapter 6 open if you want to follow along. And let's take some of the other clips in this exercise. So I'm going to select the sine bass clip here on this track. And down here in the algorithm chooser for the type of warp mode that we're going to use, I'm going to switch this to tones. So tones is good for monophonic type of audio files, which would include things like a bass part or a vocal part or maybe a synth lead or even a guitar solo. Any place where you've kind of got one note happening at a time. Now, with this one, the option that we have for adjusting what's going on is referred to as the grain size. And so this is a little different than the drum segments that we were talking about in the last video, where warping was controlled by controlling how the segments of audio were preserved. Here, the sample is being divided into grains like the sample itself is a big pile of sand. And so the grain size is controlling how big those grains of sand are. So the suggestion here is that when the pitch is clear, that you use a smaller grain size, and when the pitch is unclear, you use a larger grain size. So let's play this clip and see what happens. By the way, this was originally at 68 BPM, so let me start us at that, and then we'll move from there. Okay, with this one, you could tell that as we were going at a slower tempo when we were starting to pick up those artifacts, it actually helped to adjust that, and kind of somewhere in the middle worked with this one. It's got that kind of pure sine wave tone, but there's also that pitch bending that's happening in the waveform. And so that was giving this a little bit of a problem with how it was going to handle the different kinds of warping that were happening here. Let's go over to the next track, and let's take a look at the EP track that we have here, or the EP clip. And for this one, you'll notice that I've chosen texture. So texture is the algorithm that's designed for audio where you have multiple notes happening at the same time. So it's more of a chord rather than just a single note at a time. So we'll leave that on texture, and you'll notice that we still have the grain size option, but in addition to that, we get the flux option, which adds randomness to how it's dealing with the audio. Let's try that one. So I'm slowing it down again. So again, it felt like my adjustment here was because the pitch of this audio wasn't as clear, maybe because of the distortion in the waveform here, and that less randomness was helping with this particular one. Now, the next option that we have if we were going to change the algorithm would be to repitch. And let me go over to the drums to do that one. So I'm going to set this one to repitch. Excuse me, let me click on the right chooser here. Here you'll notice that there is no other controls. It's only the algorithm. So with repitch, as we change the tempo of the project and live warps the clip to fit the new tempo, it's going to do it the same way that we used to do with tape, as if it's speeding up the tape or slowing it down to fit the new tempo. And when that happens, it actually pitches it higher when it's sped up or lower when it's slowed down. So this was originally at 92 or so let's go to that. Check it out. So that's really interesting how you start to hear some of the samples break down and what they sound like when they're really stretched. All right. So the last thing that we have here is an entire song. And because of DJs that want to be able to play songs at different tempos, Ableton created a couple of different algorithms over time to deal with stretching these big clips. And those are called Complex and Complex Pro. Now I've got this one on Complex Pro, and we have this option here for formants. And if you don't know what formants are, if you haven't dealt with them before, formants are those fundamental frequencies that are part of how an instrument creates sound because of kind of the length of the tube or the size of the instrument itself. And sometimes when we start changing the tempo of files or pitching files, we'll actually hear some strange thing happen with those formants. And if we go back to early time stretching, things like, you may be aware of the Chipmunk cartoons where they've pitched the voices of the actors, and in doing that, back in the day, they didn't have control over those formant frequencies, and in the end, the voices started to feel like they were really tiny and small and highly pitched. And so one of the things we want to be able to do is control the formants as we start to stretch the tempo so that the file still sounds natural. All right, so here there's nothing going on if it's at 0, and if we're all the way up at 100%, the formants are supposedly fully preserved. So let's check it out as we change the tempo of this file. So you hear that's pretty amazing. Even at a really slow tempo, it's still really holding it together. And instead of working with 4 or 8 bars here, we're working with over 65. So it's pretty amazing. The other option that we have here is this envelope function. And what this does is it tries to work with the kind of frequencies that you're working with. And the suggestion is that if most of the content here is higher frequencies, go for lower envelope settings. And if the frequencies are lower, go for higher settings. And since we've got a whole song here and we've got a broad range of frequencies, I've set that right in the middle. Now, I want to point out that if I've got clips that I'm working with that I'm slowing down and it's not really working out, I'll try one of the other options. And very often I end up on Complex Pro. So for example, let's go over to the bass clip. Let me select that one. And I'm going to switch this over to Complex Pro. And let's see what happens here when I play this at a really slow tempo. Now that's like half the tempo, and we're not hearing a lot of audio artifacts there. So while there are warp modes that are optimized for different types of audio, listen carefully to the results. You never know when one of the other modes might produce better results.